Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to LiVE, the PAVRO conference in its virtual form. We're very, very excited to have you here with us today. It is my pleasure to introduce myself. My name is Helena Finn-Vickers. I'm the past president of PAVRO. I was the vice president for a little while. That was great. And I am now the AVA liaison for DRAVA, supporting PAVRO and DRAVA. And I had the pleasure of participating in last year's planning of the first PAVRO virtual conference because we had no choice. So I'd like to introduce you to my co-host today, Amanda.
Hi. Welcome everybody to this year's PAVRO's conference, Breaking Forward from Pandemic to Possibilities. My name is Amanda Maragos. I am a member of PAVRO and on a few committees, one of them being the conference committee, another one being the DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee that has recently been formed. And I am also part of the mentoring program.
Fantastic. And one of the wonderful things about PAVRO is the opportunity to network and get to know people we never would have known before. And last week I had the privilege of spending some time virtually with Amanda, and now we're buds. So it's an amazing thing. This is what PAVRO does. It connects us.
Fantastic hat, Helena.
Well, so guess what? Amanda and I are kind of similar in our, I can see why, Alex, you threw us together. So we thought, what would be a fun way to, show our support to the participants on PAVRO's conference today. So Amanda and I are wearing many hats because all of you wear many hats. And this past year, certainly, probably even more than you ever thought you could. So hats off to everyone participating today, learning, sharing, being present. This is what PAVRO and the conference committee have put together for us, these opportunities to learn and share and focus to stimulate thoughts and enhance our learning. What opportunity we have. I want to thank all of you for participating on behalf of our board and on behalf of the conference committee whose names you saw scrolling earlier. So well done to that conference committee. We hope you find new ways to be innovative in your work with volunteers and in the community, and that you realize the invaluable contributions you are making as we gently reemerge from a year like no other. Well, isn't that the truth? So it is my absolute pleasure to hand over the video to your president and mine, Alex Vasic.
Hi, everyone. Did you guys see me? Okay, so I want to, and do you hear me, more importantly? I've switched out of, let me just go to gallery view. Okay, great, yes, now I can see myself. So I have the pleasure of serving as your president this year, and I've worked very closely with the board to ensure that PAVRO is your provincial association for professionals who engage and enable volunteers and volunteerism. I'm so happy to be welcoming you here on behalf of the board and the team that has been planning this conference over the past few months. And before I start, may I share our brand new land acknowledgement. I'd like to actually read it. So if we could slow down, or the slideshow. So PAVRO acknowledges that our work and the work of our members takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across Ontario. We recognize the ways in which those of us who are settlers have benefited from colonization and reflect on the attempted genocide of Indigenous people in Canada, which spans centuries, unfortunately. We call for the reconciliation of current injustices as well as those that have been carried out against Indigenous communities, which include but are not limited to broken treaty relationships. We commit to working towards creating a just, inclusive, and vibrant community for all. We encourage you to learn more about the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples where you live, work, and play using tools like nativeland.ca. We also invite you to incorporate a land acknowledgement into your personal and/or professional lives. A sample template can be found on our website. Okay, thank you. Well, I'll keep going. We wish to express gratitude to Mother Earth and for the resources we are using and honor all the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who have been living on the land since before settlers arrived and continue to do so. We invite you to reflect upon this land acknowledgement, what it means to your personal story, and what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Children and Girls, calls for injustice means to you. This land acknowledgement is a living document that will be updated as we learn and grow. We welcome your feedback so that we can strengthen this acknowledgement as well as relationships with Indigenous people and communities. Thank you. So this is now just been posted to our website. I'm really proud of the work that has gone into crafting this piece, and we look forward to kind of continuing to develop it. Oops. Okay. So as you work through the next couple of hours with today's panel, we hope that you're inspired in your career and your professional development to consider the importance of advocacy in our profession. This is a topic that has been of great importance to our members, especially during this past year. We'd like to thank our sponsors for our 3-day event support and encourage you to visit their website. So we have some amazing sponsors, including Charity Village and Better Impact. Yay! Better Impact is actually behind this magic that's happening on your screen. And I just want to once again thank the Small and Mighty Team conference committee that pulled this all together in relatively short order, which is it's amazing. And finally, I really keep my fingers crossed that next May we can actually meet in person. It would be amazing. So thank you. Enjoy the next 3 days, and I'm going to turn it back to our MCs now.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that. So, take my hat off again. So, before we start our stimulating topic of the day, let's just take a minute to adjust our thoughts with a really short and fun activity to help you get familiar with the reaction to buttons on your Zoom on the bottom. I know many of us have been using Zoom, but I think for the sake of today's conference, let's take a look at the reaction buttons and enjoy some fun together. So please respond to the following questions that I'm going to ask with either a thumbs up for the first choice or a clap for the second choice. So if everybody looks to the bottom right on the, there's a panel there of different options. One says reactions. So if you click on that right now, you will be able to see various reactions. And so my first question to you is, do you prefer movies or television? And if movies is your answer, thumbs up. And if television is your answer, hand clap. So movies or television? Great. Okay. Second question is, do you prefer spring or summer? Great. All right, next question is, do you prefer ketchup or mustard as a condiment? Okay, and our next question is, do you prefer fruits or vegetables? That's a tricky one. That's hard because it depends what you do with them, right? Okay, we've got one more question for you. Do you prefer, and this is just like, let's just go there for a minute. Do you prefer a beach vacation or a camping vacation? Do we remember what those things are? Yes, we do. Beach or camping? It's great. I'm taking a minute so I can scroll and see everybody's faces and answers. Fantastic. Okay, great. So I am so happy to introduce a past PAVRO board member, who's got extensive experience and who's a great advocate, an educator, and a staunch champion of our sector. This is Riva Cooper, who will be our facilitator for the day as we discuss advocacy, building partnerships in our profession. Riva.
Thank you, Amanda. Welcome, everybody. We have about 120 people here today. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Very excited about the opportunity to connect with you and provincial and national associations to move forward. I'd like to give you a bit of a background on how we came to this session. PAVRO, Professional Association of Volunteer Leaders of Ontario, has a vision that really speaks to possibilities. And that's a world where the professional management and leadership of volunteers is respected, valued, and recognized as essential to a civic society. Now, since we're not quite there yet, and because the landscape has significantly changed over the past year, PAVRO re-engaged its members to ask them about advocacy. And they told us that advocacy for the profession is very important to them. And they identified some areas of focus which formed the basis of the questions that we're going to discuss today. Just so people know, we're using a broad definition of advocacy, an activity by an individual or a group that aims to influence decisions within political, economic, or social institutions. So we're looking both at how we can support volunteer engagement leaders to advocate on their own behalf for their own skills, professional competencies, and impact, and also how we can advocate for quality volunteer engagement more broadly through the critical role of volunteer engagement to strengthen the sector and build back better. This takes place internally within organizations themselves and in the larger context with funders, government, influencers, and others. So as we move into recovery and as organizations continue to adapt to achieve their mission and to even survive, engaging volunteers becomes more important perhaps than ever before. Skilled professionals who are the enablers, the connectors, the link between community and mission are a keystone to any recovery plan. I've been watching with great interest what our provincial and national organizations have been doing during this time for the sector, and I'm so thrilled to have representatives with us here today. Now, their bios were on the conference materials and they're on the slides, so I'm not going to take the time right now to tell you a lot about them, just to welcome them, to start with their first question. I will go through asking our panelists who are Ontario Nonprofit Network. We have Kathy Taylor, Ontario Volunteer Centre Network, Corrine Strong, Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada. Michelle is here with us, and Bernadette is here from Imagine Canada. So my first question is, can the panelists each tell us what their organization is doing now related to advocacy? And I would like to start with Imagine Canada. Bernadette Johnson is the Director of Advocacy and Knowledge Mobilization. So I believe that our panelists were going to be pinned so we could see them. Right now I'm seeing everybody, so maybe we'll change my view.
Okay.
Great,
Hi,
Bernadette. Hi, welcome.
Thanks, Riva, and everyone at PAVRO. Happy to be speaking today. So I guess, do you mean sort of right now, post federal budget, or sort of over the entire year?
Even leading into the federal budget, because you were doing some things that our members may not know about. So
sure.
Maybe over the last while.
Yeah, the last while. Well, I guess at Imagine, we do, for those who aren't as familiar with our work, we do research on the sector and a variety of different topic areas, anything pertaining to capacity issues, to anything related to public policy. So our research infrastructure really came in handy during the pandemic. We fielded a couple surveys of registered charities. We don't have the capacity to survey nonprofits yet, but we're working on it. and to gather information on how the sector was faring at different points of the pandemic, early on in April, and then again in November, and there's one in the field again right now. And this information went to directly inform our public policy development, our GR work, our government relations work at the federal level, and some of our public policy development as well. So our public policy agenda right away focused on what we call the three-legged stool. So this was the first leg of the stool was the extension of eligibility for the emergency measures, the rent subsidy, the old commercial rent assistance subsidy program, the wage subsidy, and then the business account, the Canada Emergency Business Account, ensuring that those broad-based federal emergency measures were eligible to nonprofits and charities, and which we were successful with, and we were able to ensure that charities and nonprofits had specific, unique eligibility criteria for the wage subsidy, which was really important. So those sort of immediate inclusion in the emergency measures was the first leg of the stool. The second leg of the stool was, of course, the stabilization ask. Our chief economist at the time, who's now retired, was able to do some modeling on the impact of the pandemic on the charitable sector. It was predicted that throughout the year 2020, the amount of funding that would be pulled from the charitable nonprofit sector would be in the realm of 15 to 30 billion. That's a huge gap, 15 to 30, but somewhere in there. So the projected social deficit thesis that he had been working on since 2016, a gap in the demand for charitable sector services and the ability for us to deliver on them had come to our shores in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. So with that data in hand, we asked the government for $10 billion in stabilization. And then subtracted, there were a few measures that were advanced, the emergency measures, the wage subsidy, but also the Emergency Community Support Fund and other targeted program related measures that we subtracted from that amount. So that amount was condensed throughout the year. But we, persisted in asking for this core operating support, which was at the crux of the stabilization fund ask for the entire sector, eligibility based on need. And the third leg of the stool was donations incentives. And we wanted this to come to fruition after stabilization had come into effect and after organizations that were able to avail themselves of the emergency measures had the opportunity to do so. So these three-legged stools were sequential and they were mutually reinforcing as we saw them. So our advocacy efforts persisted throughout the year at a highly intense pace, more intense than we've ever done our GR work before. So and worked really in coalition with a number of different sector actors. The energy in the sector, the level of activity in the sector over the last year has been astonishing and really great to see, and we hope that it continues. So our work was also building coalitions, linking conversations, bringing people together that maybe aren't used to being in the space or may not be as acquainted with other sort of leadership in the space as well. So the federal budget, our federal budget response program was a statement, released to the sector where we summarized sort of the high level notes of what was in the budget. And what we've been telling, our GR targets is that this budget is really represents a watershed moment for the sector. The frequency of the mention of charities and nonprofits in the budget is tenfold more than what it normally is. The language, we have yet to do, you know, a content analysis of the budget, which we would love to do. But the areas of mention of the sector, the quality of the information that is used, noting ONN's research is mentioned a few times in the budget, as well as Imagine Canada's. The sophistication of the appreciation of the sector in the budget, even if, you know, people are, and, you know, we're a bit, our reaction to the measures is a bit lukewarm in some areas, but I think that we can't deny the significance of the acknowledgement of a partnership between the two sectors in this federal budget.
Wonderful.
So,
Bernadette, I'm actually going to stop you there because we do have a question a little later about government relations. So we'll get into that. But that is an amazing big picture national overview of what Imagine has been doing. And I think that some of our members who are here may have been able to continue their work because of the assistance to the sector that was provided, you know, through your advocacy efforts, and moving forward too, your efforts are going to continue to help these organizations get their volunteer programs, get their staff, get everybody back on the ground. So thank you for that big picture overview of what you're doing, and we'll come back to some of those important initiatives. I want to let people know that we have 5 or 6 prepared questions, and while our panelists are talking, all of the participants are welcome to type their comments or questions into the chat bar. And our MCs are monitoring that. And after the formal part of our discussion, we will address some of your questions. What we will also be doing is going into small groups a little later on after our break, and it will be an opportunity to connect and brainstorm more about what we've heard. So thank you, Bernadette, for that great beginning. Staying at the national level, I'd like to introduce Paula Spivak, who's President and CEO of Volunteer Canada, to tell us what Volunteer Canada has been up to with advocacy for the sector and for volunteer engagement and other important things you've been up to. Welcome, Paula. Oh, your mute is still on. We all get caught on that.
You bet. Listening more than speaking. So I also want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I live, work, and volunteer is unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And that in addition to this land acknowledgement, Volunteer Canada is committed to understanding how we can better contribute to both truth and reconciliation by addressing our past with an open mind and an open heart to build a better future together. So the question at hand about advocacy, I would say that it comes in two ways. One is promoting the value and the importance of volunteering. And with that comes the importance and the value of the infrastructure that facilitates volunteering. And I know we'll talk about government relations later, but then there's public policy that supports, facilitates, and recognizes volunteering. So those are some of the things that guide our work. So for example, a few years ago when the Special Senate Committee on the Charitable Sector was receiving testimony, we brought forward a number of issues, and 4 of them were actually in the recommendations made by the Senate Committee. So first, there was the importance of having a national voluntary action strategy. And some of you may know that Nigeria, Australia, and Ireland have national strategies. And of course, here in Canada, Quebec has had a national strategy within the province of Quebec that really looks at volunteering in all ways and how it is supported, recognized, and promoted. The second one had to do with supporting through grants and contributions the infrastructure that was necessary for facilitating and supporting and recognizing volunteers. And then there was others that dealt with screening and police checks and some other things. So that was one area that we focused on over the last few years. The other thing was looking at some of the social trends and legislative issues that connect our sector to the agenda and priorities of either government or business and others. And so when you look at the value of volunteering in terms of social inclusion, in terms of skills building, in terms of course, emergency response that we've seen, or youth engagement, you could really make the case that volunteers contribute in an important way to these issues that are also priorities of other players. If you look at the capacity, the value of volunteering, I know a few years ago we created the value of volunteering wheel. And again, that was a way to contribute to the public discussion and advocacy around what is the value of volunteering to volunteers themselves, whether it's raising self-esteem, health benefits, and feeling included, building the capacity of organizations, creating more safe and resilient neighborhoods and communities, and of course, looking at society. When we look at some of the important social changes, whether it's same-sex marriage or impaired driving and other matters, we can see that volunteers have really contributed to progressive social policy in many ways. So those are some of the things that we've found important to connect. When we look at the importance of the contributions of volunteers to the Sustainable Development Goals or to issues related to climate change, anti-racism, and some of the other issues that we're all dealing with, again, we could see the value and importance. And the more we advocate for the role volunteers play in those issues that are top of mind to the general public, politicians, business leaders, and so on, I think the more that we can advocate for the importance of promoting and supporting and recognizing volunteers, but also the infrastructure and the profession of volunteer resource management. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Paula. Now let's go to our professional association on the national level, Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada, and I'd like to welcome Michelle Mungar-Lumley, who's the Vice President now and former Advocacy Chair. Michelle, could you give us an idea of what the MPC is currently doing in the area of advocacy that would be of interest to our members?
Sure, yeah. This is very timely, I think, in the conversations for sure. And VMPC as a national organization is committed to our members and working with them to try and find solutions to issues and connections. And advocacy, we're just going through strategic planning, and it's very interesting some of the conversations we had even as a board and surveys that we've had with our members and what does that look like. And a lot of what we are aligning to do is to support our members by empowering them. So we're very acutely aware that we're a volunteer board and our resources can be limited, and we need to build connections with other organizations and within the profession themselves. I'm out in Calgary, and so I have issues that are related to being an Albertan, and somebody else has issues that are related to being an Ontarian. But there's also a lot of commonalities within that as well. And so right now we're working on building resources for our members to be able to support them in advocating and building connections and feedback. Our member connection call coming up in June is going to be on advocacy, and we're hoping to launch an activity to engage our members in advocacy actions. Even things like having conversations with our colleagues about what we do is advocacy. And I think sometimes we make advocacy into this big thing that's so overwhelming, and I know we'll talk about stuff later, but we look at it as such this big thing. And yes, as a national organization, we need to look at it nationally, but individually, we all have ways that we can connect and build our own networks and build that advocacy from the ground up. And I think a lot of people are so overwhelmed by that. And we saw that when we did our survey with our members earlier this year to inform our strategic planning, is that members really do want advocacy, but they couldn't define what that meant to them. A lot of it. There were some, but there were things that, we're like, is that in our scope? What should we be doing with that? And so we really need to have those conversations, and we acknowledge that and are going to be doing that. We're going to be doing mini surveys. Our connection call in June will be talking about advocacy and finding out what members want. What is that definition of what advocacy is? Where should we start? And maybe it's not starting, maybe it's the continuation, right? Depending on where you're at, but acknowledging that we're all individually responsible for advocacy too. And it's not just looking to organizations to do it for us. We all play a role in that. And so that's a lot of our focus right now. However, we do have a volunteer, Heidi Jacob from BC, who is working on more national level in Ottawa. I know she's been working with Imagine Canada and building connections from the VNPC space. She also was somebody who shared information for the Senate report as well as a representative of volunteer engagement professionals. So we are doing pieces of that as well. And then also something like our impact awards. So I don't know if you all know, we have national awards sponsored by Better Impact. And looking at, we just had our second year, we're moving into our third year of these awards, and looking at how can we leverage that knowledge that we have some amazing people in our space, and not just our members, but just in volunteer management, volunteer engagement as a whole, we have some incredible people that are doing amazing things and showcasing that. And so we have plans to grow that program, that award, over the next few years, to be able to recognize, to promote, to market what we all do internally, but also externally too, and getting some more attention to that as a space, which then allows us to have some leverage to do some of those other pieces that we really would like to be doing in creating change and national structures across the country, whether it's the police check thing or working with Volunteer Canada in the spaces of the volunteerism side, where we focus on more of the professional development side, working along together, because they do go hand in hand. They don't have to be completely separate, working through that as well. Yes. So we do have a lot of things in our pocket, and we have a lot of things we want to do. Okay. Unfortunately, pandemic has, as all of us have dealt with, pandemic has changed the climate a little bit. And so trying to figure out where we're going and looking at building a strategic plan that's more of a year or 2 years as opposed to the 5-year mark because of that. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. Now, we have with us Corinne Strong, representing the Ontario Volunteer Centre Network. She's a member of the leadership team and also Executive Director of Volunteer Mississauga, Brampton, and Caledon. Now, certainly volunteer centres have a network with Volunteer Canada. I'm wondering, Corinne, if you have anything specific from the Ontario Volunteer Centres that may be happening related to advocacy that you would like to share with us.
Absolutely. So thank you. And first of all, I want to acknowledge the organizations, my fellow panelists, for all the work that you have been doing on advocacy, because it has helped the OVCN and volunteer centers tremendously. We're also a volunteer based network. So we have some leaders that are at the OVCN level, but we have no funding to operate. So we rely heavily on the advocacy that's been done by ONN and Imagine Canada specifically, and Volunteer Canada. And speaking of Volunteer Canada, so a number of us that sit on the OVCN leadership table are also represented at the National Volunteer Centre Council, which is organized by Volunteer Canada and led by Allison. And she has done an incredible job to get us to focus on different areas. And one of them has definitely been advocacy. And as a result of that, we did quite a bit of work on working together on a national level to come up with an advocacy toolkit that was very specific to volunteer centers, and really raising awareness because, there's over 200 volunteer centers across Canada, and, very little knowledge of the work that we do and what we have been accomplishing, certainly during the pandemic and the role that we have played. So in September, we launched a campaign that really consisted of an advocacy toolkit, but out of that was a letter that was produced that really raised awareness about volunteer centers, our role, how we're connected with leaders of volunteers and the work, how important it is for us to make sure that we acknowledge the work that they do, both on a national, provincial, and certainly local level as well. And this advocacy letter was signed by a number of the volunteer centers across Canada, and then we used it to advocate locally within our own volunteer center framework and regions to advocate to local governments, social media, and it was a start. And we're now working, again, led by Volunteer Canada, but on sort of on an Ontario level, we're trying to pilot really phase 2 of that advocacy, what that's going to look like. And again, there will be a letter, but I also, from a local level, I also wanted to iterate that advocacy for volunteer centers, and especially to raise the profile of leaders of volunteers, has to start at the organizational level. Because at the organizational level, we hear all the time, during learning sessions and workshops, that leaders of volunteers are not invited at the leadership tables in their own organizations. And yet
you're taking us into our next question.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to stop you there if that's all right.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really interesting to hear Paula and yourself talk about supporting volunteerism and awareness and advocacy for volunteerism and for the infrastructure that supports that, and for the people on the ground and who are our members. And that's a really valuable context. So we will get into that a little bit more for sure. Thank you so much. Now, Kathy Taylor with the Ontario Nonprofit Network, the Executive Director, you have also been doing some very interesting sector-wide advocacy lately. And I wonder if you could share your activities with us.
Great, thanks so much, Riva. It's a pleasure to be here from Erin, Ontario, and I'm humbled to live and work on the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. I will apologize if my video is a little fuzzy at times, but rural internet in Ontario is not what it's supposed to be yet. So fingers crossed we can get through this. So ONN, for those of you that are new to us, is a provincial network with a mission to engage with and for nonprofits and charities in Ontario, of which there are 58,000 nonprofits and charities in Ontario, and we know that means 5 million plus volunteers. So what our whole purpose is advocacy. Our whole mission is advocacy. That's all we do. Every year we define our advocacy priorities, and they're in 4 areas. So our people, so the people that work in the sector and the people that volunteer for the sector, our financing, so how the sector is supported and financed, our regulatory environment, so that's all those policies, legislation, bits and pieces that affect our day-to-day work, and our data about the sector and data that as organizations we have in the sector. So at the beginning of the pandemic, those policy priorities, we approve new priorities every year. And in the people bucket, certainly our focus has been on decent work for nonprofit employees. And I'm happy to talk about that a bit later. I think there's a question on that, as well as barriers to volunteerism, things like police records checks, for example, privacy legislation, insurance, and those issues. So we typically focus at the provincial level. What I will say, though, in addition to what policy priorities we had in January 2020, of course, they shifted dramatically over the last 12 months. And our reactive work became quite most of what we did. And in terms of the effect on volunteers and organizations, we really pivoted, unfortunately, using that word, in the last year to focus on the health and safety of our communities and the organizations that serve them. And so we did a lot of work during the pandemic on obviously insurance, everything around vaccination rollout, education, the role of nonprofits and charities. We advocated for nonprofit workers to be eligible for vaccinations. We advocated for supports for organizations, for removal of red tape and any administration for organizations so that they could get through the last few months. And so as we go forward, we will still focus on those 4 areas of our people, our finances, the regulatory environment, and our data. But what we are doing in those areas truly is shifting as the ground shifts beneath us.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Wow, such impressive work that people have been doing on an ongoing basis and have been doing over the last year to really help with what needs to be done today. Okay, so thank you for that big picture summary of what you're all doing. And I also echo thank you for the amount of work that you've done and for being here with us today to share that with us. The next question, I am going to zero in more on volunteer engagement professionals. We know that volunteer management expertise is essential for organizations to be able to engage the community and achieve social impact. We all know that. Yet, we also know that volunteer management expertise and impact, like volunteers, is often taken for granted and is often not well understood in the broader community, and as somebody already mentioned, even within organizations in the sector. When volunteer engagement is not a supported role, when it's done off the side of someone's desk along with other jobs, when organizations are hiring people who are unskilled and unqualified because they really don't know any better, when volunteer engagement professionals are not hired or let go or are redirected permanently or not given a budget or a seat at the table, the organization and the sector suffer. And ultimately, this means that our ability to engage the community to meet urgent human needs is compromised. So those are all things that our members told us when we did our advocacy work this year. Added to those issues is the larger sector issue of the profession of volunteer management is often not a choice for skilled people because of lack of competitive wages, benefits, and the measure of job security, even when compared to other jobs within the sector. So I suspect that as we get back to the new normal, organizations will certainly be looking at fundraisers because there's been a huge drop in revenue and we're used to, understanding that we need money. We're not as used to understanding what the community can bring to support our organizations at this time and the mobilizers that need to help us to do that. So I think it's a really pertinent question about these are longstanding issues, but what can we do right now to ensure that volunteers are positioned to help, to support the communities that are going to need support coming out of this, and that the organizations are strengthened by ensuring that they have both the human resource expertise and the financial expertise that they're going to need going forward. So I guess I have a couple of questions I'm going to put together. How can we increase awareness within the sector itself for the critical role that skilled, qualified, standalone, and supported volunteer management professionals play in organizational success? Kathy, I am going to start with you because you mentioned decent work. So you might have some ideas. Let us know generally about that work because it's certainly connected, and also anything specific you have, any advice to our members in terms of how they might be able to advocate on their own behalf within organizations, and then any advocacy resources that you have. And I know you did share a couple of advocacy tools that we've shared with our members. So how can we, support our members, increase awareness within organizations themselves about the hugely important role of volunteer management expertise as we move forward, and Kathy, you can start us in terms of the context of decent work and what you're doing in that.
Sure. Thanks so much, Riva. So definitely at ONN, we're really passionate about decent work for nonprofit workers. Decent work is actually a term from the International Labor Organization, part of the UN. And it's one of the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 8 is about decent work. So that language is both international and being recognized across the world, actually. So it is a great framework to be able to kind of hang our hat on. And, you know, particularly in the last few years, we've been focused on the intersectionality of decent work. And what that means is, how is decent work in our sector, how is it different for women, for racialized people, for people of different ages and stages in their career? So a couple of things we've done that tools are available. We have a decent work charter that organizations can sign and approve, and a decent work checklist that organizations can use to identify how they're doing on a spectrum of things, everything from contract work to employee benefits, top-ups for maternity leaves, RSPs and pension plans, and everything in between. So we do have some decent work tools that organizations can access. But I would say, you know, a couple of things, particularly to volunteer management professionals. It is not unique to that profession in our sector. There are professions in our sector that are mostly women dominated, we call them gendered, that have less compensation, that have less benefits than other parts of our sector. So it's not equal within even within the nonprofit and charitable sector. And we really do need to shine a light on that. And we're trying to focus on both data, labor market information, sharing the stories. We have a report called our Women's Voices report, which really laid out the discrepancies within our sector. I think some of the solutions that we can think about. So overall, I think all nonprofits and charities should, it is our people that do the work. And when our people are well supported, they do a better job and we meet our mission. So the business case is very clear, actually. If someone is on contract for 5 years versus 1 year, they stay longer, they build their capacity, and they do a better job. And so we need to share those sorts of messages, not only internally with our executive directors and our boards, but with our funders and government supporters as well. And we are seeing a shift, and the pandemic really did help us to highlight that longer term funding, more overhead, more general operating support actually helped organizations be able to navigate such a difficult time. So there are some options on the horizon. There are also some sector solutions. Now there's a pension plan in Ontario, there's employee benefit programs. So there are sector solutions to this work. However, I do think there are, so there's systemic solutions that affect the whole sector that we can work on together. And certainly we're taking a lead on many of those. But specifically regarding the volunteer management profession, there definitely is a lack of value proposition for this profession in our sector. And so really thinking about, my advice would be to really think about the value proposition of having those roles in an organization. What's the impact? How does it add to the efficiency of the organization? What is not being done when there's not those rules available? And really, in particularly, the recovery of, as we go through the recovery, is going to require actually more volunteers. And the pandemic, we saw a growth of volunteers and grassroots initiative and mutual aid networks. And so there's a huge opportunity right now to position your profession as one that can relieve risk management, that can engage new voices and new volunteers, that can, using the volunteer program, can build and address anti-racism in your organizations. So there's lots of ways to think about how this profession can then help the organizations and ultimately our communities do a better job going forward. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to jump in a bit later.
Thank you. Great practical advice. Thank you. And again, staying on the national level, I'm going to move over to Paula. And again, the question is, how can leaders of volunteers advocate within organization on the importance of that role and supporting that roles. Does Volunteer Canada have resources that can help? I know certainly we always talk about the Canadian Code as a resource that's been around for a long time, but is just fundamental in terms of helping to convey what leaders of volunteers do and what structure needs to be in place to support volunteers. So what else can you tell us?
Well, this may be an over-exaggeration, but sometimes when I hear people say, I've been a volunteer, therefore I'm qualified to be a manager of volunteer resources, I think, well, I've been a patient for many years. Does that qualify me to be a medical profession? I know that's an exaggeration, but I think part of it is related to what you were just saying, Riva, that we need to raise awareness of the standards of practice that are followed through volunteer resource management on a community level and in organizations. So on a community level, when you look at floods, forest fires, welcoming refugees, and now the pandemic, the role that volunteer centers play on a community-wide basis in terms of mobilizing also requires the expertise of assessment and matching and interviewing and often an understanding of the unique qualifications for unique positions. I think in an organization similarly. So one might not think that managers of volunteer resources or leaders need to know about human rights legislation and employment standards, acts, and so on. And when you look at, the Mental Health Act and various legislation in provinces and territories that directly relates to the work that we do in volunteer centers and as leaders. In terms of within organizations, elevating the position, when organizations see that engaging volunteers in an intentional way, as leaders do, will build cultural competencies in organizations, will create stronger community relations, will create possibilities for partnerships. These are the kinds of things that are strategic directions of an organization as a whole that volunteer engagement contributes to. Research that shows that those that volunteer tend to contribute financially to organizations. So there's many things that I think we could do within our organizations and within communities that elevate the role of volunteer centers and the professions and leaders of volunteer resources.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bernadette, I realize Imagine Canada looks at things from a broader scale. Do you have any suggestions or resources or anything to add to this part of the discussion?
So when it comes to those capacity issues, capacity related issues outside of sort of the public policy or research realm, that's really the standards program area of the organization. We have the standards program is for the sector, by the sector. It's Imagine is the secretariat, but we convene a number of different tables of rotating membership of sector leaders to inform the evolution of a set of standards, for lack of a better term, or I think they're exploring a better word for it, but the standards program is what it's called currently. And one area of the program pertains to volunteer involvement. And on the policy side, we really defer to Volunteer Canada, their policy agenda and activity related to volunteering at the federal level. But I encourage folks on the call today to review the Standards Handbook to see what the Standards Council has identified that way. In terms of research, we know that the way that the crisis has impacted sort of the volunteering landscape, it's quite profound and in some ways fascinating. Our research has shown that 60% of volunteers have not returned, and that some organizations are forced to replace those positions with paid staff. Of course, many volunteer positions are crucial to the functioning of survival of an organization. But yeah, in terms of policy, we defer to Paula.
Great, and thank you for mentioning the Imagine standards, because it's another tool that we can show to our organizations that there are different key pieces of well-functioning, well-respected organizations. Well-respected, I mean, in terms of funders, the funders would look at organizations as having your set of standards, and the Imagine Canada is broader, but it does have volunteer engagement standards in there as well, which again is one way of letting others know that it is an important piece of this sector puzzle. Go ahead, Bernadette.
I would also mention we have, so some may remember the HR Sector Council, the national body out of the Voluntary Sector Initiative that presided over the creation and dissemination of human resources materials for the nonprofit sector. Imagine Canada is adopting what's left of those resources and we're working now with some partners to update those resources, and a number of them do pertain to volunteer management.
Great, thank you. And the national occupational competencies or standards are also a very important to have historically been a very important tool for our members and for having organizational stakeholders understand the job, the 400 tasks that are in the job according to that document, which is way more than most other jobs in the sector, just as an aside. Thank you. Corinne, anything to add?
Yeah,
Yes, you're working with organizations every day. So ideas about how we can increase their understanding and support of the volunteer engagement, the mobilization within their own organizations.
Yeah, so locally, we constantly hear from leaders of volunteers that they're not invited to sit on their organization's leadership table. And I think we need to take a two-tier internal advocacy approach to this. The first one would definitely be focus on advocating to senior leadership and their respective board directors so that they can be at the important tables where decisions are being made. And then secondly, also convince staff throughout these organizations that work with volunteers, that these volunteers are not coming to take their jobs, but rather that they're coming in to work on specific projects with a start and an end date, and especially when you're talking about skilled volunteers. I also think that cannot underestimate the value that skilled-based volunteers can bring, and the value that the leaders of volunteers play in making sure that the organization, as we're moving into the recovery, can really benefit from those volunteers in a virtual capacity. But, you know, just think of the resources from skilled volunteers that can come into an organization, you know, to help with some HR planning, some even legal aspects that need to be covered, project planning, you know, looking at strategic plans and sort of evaluating that. And I also think that there is definitely a huge issue with there not being enough dollars for professional development. Many volunteer centers offer excellent courses for leaders of volunteers. They work with volunteer centers who have learning centers. And so I really think that a stronger partnership with PAVRO and even VMPC to assign credits to courses that volunteer managers take and being able to count them towards their certification to really help to elevate the profession, because I think that that's going to be so crucial. And I did see a little nugget of hope in the response to the recommendations from the charitable sector report that Rada Omnivar had played a huge role in. But I think there will be an opportunity to perhaps talk about that later. But definitely, you know, it's really interesting locally. I sit at a community response table for the region of Peel, and there's about 200 leaders of organizations that gather every week. We started when the pandemic began. And, you know, from time to time, we do these idea boards and, you know, to talk about challenges. And one of them that comes up constantly is that we can't get enough volunteers. And that just really makes me wonder, like, where are you guys with this? Because the reality is that leaders of volunteers are the ones responsible for recruiting those volunteers, continuing to engage your volunteers, but then you've decided to, there's too much risk or whatever. And so you've laid off your leaders of volunteers, and, they don't play a big role in this recovery process. So I'm always extremely disappointed and just a huge advocate at those tables to really make sure that they do engage their leaders of volunteers.
Okay, great. I think we're really touching on some important messages for future planning for all of our organizations. I'm going to ask Michelle to add anything you would like to add in terms of something VMPC deals with all the time, supporting their members to advocate on their own behalf within their own organizations. And then I'm actually going to prompt the next question, because as always happens, we get into lots of great information and the time is going by. So I'm going to throw in the next question too that you might want to add onto, which is there are some things happening provincially and nationally in terms of government. The whole issue of, is there a home for volunteerism, for volunteer engagement in government, is something that our members brought up. So I do want to touch on that before we wrap up. The question for everyone after you hear all of this great information is, how can we move forward? Where are opportunities for moving forward together and strengthen volunteer engagement in the sector? So, we've been hearing everything. I think great information so far in terms of within the organizations and the view of volunteerism and what it takes to mobilize and engage volunteers effectively. Also the government piece, I think our members would be very interested in hearing some of the things that you're all doing at this point in history with government. So Michelle, if you can kind of address those two questions to whatever extent you would like.
Okay, so I think I love hearing what everyone's doing and the messaging behind that and the conversation around that for sure. I think that one of the things we see with VMPC is a lot of that stuff within the organization, and why am I not at the leadership table? Why am I not being heard? And I think one of the things that we see as a common thread is around sharing our stories and sharing what does that even look like? And oftentimes we know that volunteers don't grow on trees. We know the work that goes on behind the scenes. We know what our successes are, but how often do we sit and say, wow, that was I did something amazing there. And how often do we go and tell people about that? When do we share our successes? We share them in our annual reports. We share them in our messaging to the community around a certain time of the year, our AGMs, all that. When do we share them within our organization? When do we sit in a meeting and say, this is what I've done. This is how amazing our volunteers are. This is what, as an organization, we've accomplished. And then recognizing, depending on how your organization is structured, recognizing the people in your organization that may not be considered volunteer engagement professionals, but support that too. And sharing those stories regularly starts that conversation. And I agree wholeheartedly that volunteer engagement professionals should be at the leadership table. I do. I absolutely 100% agree. I've worked in organizations where that has worked really well. And I've worked in organizations that absolutely, I was never going to get there. And I think big organizations that have hierarchy, the reality is that volunteer engagement professionals are probably never, I shouldn't say never, right now are not going to be at that leadership table. For example, my day job, I work in a quite large organization, and I report to our executive director of human resources, our human culture department, who reports into our CEO. I am not sitting at that leadership table anytime soon. And so what is my role? Well, my role, as I see it and how we talk with our members and staff is, okay, I can't get there, but my supervisor, who is human resources, who doesn't really know what I do on a daily basis, right? I need to educate her. I need to give her knowledge so that she can. So it's not always the person doing the day-to-day of the volunteer engagement piece that has to sit at the table when it's not feasible in that moment. But our responsibility to ensure that those that do understand what we do and share our successes and understand, and using things like the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement. If your organization hasn't adopted it, why? I can say from personal experience and experience working with our members, that's a game changer. If you can go and say that an organization that sits in Ottawa has this document that we should be making sure we're aligned to and adopting from a board level, that's a game changer, right? And so we really need to be sharing our stories both internally and externally on a regular basis. We need to be sharing what we do to those around us who don't understand. And we wear so many hats. And I think that's where the challenge lies, is that, well, I mean, there's other reasons why the challenge lies, but is the fact that we are accountants, we are event planners, we are schedulers and HR professionals, and we're all these things, and people can't wrap their head around why we're doing it all. And we're needed to, but we're the first position that gets cut when times are tough. And Corinne, you were talking about that, the idea that we have a pandemic, things shut down, okay, volunteers out. But we know volunteers are capacity builders, they're low cost capacity builders. So why is the person that's responsible for building that capacity out, and then other people have to pick up that slack, and then they start to realize what we do, right? And they're only doing pieces of it. And so I think that we need to have that conversation. I think it comes from us as professionals in our organizations. We need to be able to speak up to those and not be afraid. Like if it's off the corner of your desk, start asking why aren't we building this, and not be so worried about losing our jobs, but rather speaking up and building our careers. But it also happens from an organizational point, from VMPC, from all of our organizations. We need to be empowering our members and empowering people to be able to speak up, and then share and gather that information so that we can create resources that then allow people to be able to go to their supervisors and say, can you nominate me for this award? Because most of the time, their supervisors have no clue. There's awards out there for volunteer management professionals. They have no clue. There's grants and different things out there that we could be tapping into. And we need to be unafraid to have those hard conversations and acknowledge that this is a career, this is a profession, and we own it, and we need to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Boy, this is a discussion we could have all day, but I think the important thing is that we're together for the first time that I know of, and that we're finding out what people are doing. We hopefully out of today will come to some ideas about where our goals align and how we might be able to support the work of each other. You know, when I hear about and know that leaders of volunteers are not at the table, and at this point they probably won't be, it really concerns me, because the leaders of volunteers are the ones that have the skills and the passion and the capacity to engage the community for those skilled volunteers, to help the organizations come out the other side of this. So, you know, hopefully this will spur us on towards that. So we are running out of time. There are some great ideas, and I think, like I say, the most valuable piece of this is hearing what you are all doing, with a view to seeing what are the common messages, what are the common goals, what are the common strategies we can use to support the work of each other. So that said, I would like to get the last question on the table before we open it up to everybody who has to put questions in the chat bar. And because I know that some of you are working on a place for volunteerism or a place for the sector within government, which is another important piece. So I wonder whoever would like to who is working on that area to update us, a home in government. Paula, do you want to start?
Sure. I think that on one hand, it would be great if those two things went together, but at the moment, they're not necessarily going to go together.
Yes.
So currently, there is a unit within Employment and Social Development Canada that has a mandate to promote and support volunteerism. And that is a unit that we often collaborate. In fact, they collaborated with us on National Volunteer Week, which was really terrific this year. And one of the things that was accepted in our collaboration was that the main point is recognizing and celebrating volunteers, but it was also intentionally to celebrate all those who support and facilitate volunteers. So you may have noticed that campaign had a day where we talked about the importance of recognizing leaders of volunteer engagement, the importance of recognizing volunteer centers, the importance of recognizing those in corporations that are involved in corporate community engagement and employee volunteering and so on. So that is something that I think we could build upon. The other thing is that there is a collaboration with Public Safety Canada as well around vulnerable sector checks and some of the screening issues. And we've been working with them. And there is an interest in connecting more with Employment and Social Development Canada to kind of consolidate some of the thinking around volunteer engagement. So I'm feeling hopeful that something will happen. I hope it will happen within context of a broader sector home and government, but for the moment, there's just some energy there.
Okay, great. And Bernadette, you certainly talked about the big picture advocacy you've been doing for the sector within government. Do you have anything to add or any idea about where what we're talking about today might fit? Just any thoughts quickly?
Yeah, and the home and government file is a priority for the sector. It's a priority for us. There was a question in the chat about, how do we build on sector recognition in this budget? It's going to be really hard to maintain the relationship gains that have been made. The policy gains that have been made, we're at an inflection point. The gains could be steeper and faster moving forward if there was that institutional mechanism between the two sectors to have those relationships. We want to make sure that the knowledge that the government does now have in many different pockets about the sector, about the sector's infrastructure, is maintained, and we see that the best mechanism for that being a home and government. Right now, the de facto home and government is Minister Hussein's office, the Minister of what was ESDC. So there is discussion over the most appropriate place for home and government for the sector, and that it may not be ESDC since it's primarily a funding body, but it needs to, the principles underlying the optimal home and government would be a minister, an ADM, or a secretariat function that could oversee policy coordination across the federal government and between the provinces as well. And CRA has been talked about, but it administers the Income Tax Act, and it's not really about enabling policy. So there's a few other options I can go into.
Okay. That's okay, but there is work being done at the federal level of a government home, perhaps, for the sector. Great. And provincially, I think we feel that there used to be more of the Ministry of Citizenship used to be kind of where volunteerism fit. Does anybody have an update for our members of, as we wrap this up and go to the questions for the group? Anybody update us? Do we have a home for volunteerism in Ontario? Do we have a link with the provincial government to further some of our goals and strategies? Does anybody want to quickly speak to that?
I can speak to it very quickly.
Great.
You're right, Riva. There used to be, a strong volunteer action plan in place produced by the voluntary sector unit at that time until the Conservative government came into power. So now they're talking about establishing this emergency volunteer unit, and it's in fact it's part of the Senate that started this, and so we're not sure where this is going to end up. What I do know is that the current government has felt that throwing technology at coming up with a response to gain volunteers and creating this database through Spark Ontario, it doesn't work because it's meaningful volunteer engagement has to be starting with leaders of volunteers. They're the ones that make that happen. So we need to find a way to let the government know. And they did have a survey out, but there weren't really a lot of questions around that. So I really think that, the focus should be, because it looks like from the conversations that I had that, there's not going to be
there's not
room.
yeah.
Yeah, we definitely need to do more. But Reva, if I could just mention one thing.
Absolutely.
On a federal level, the one thing that really intrigued me about the Senate report, the roadmap to stronger charitable sector, that there was a little bit of hope under the recommendation number 2. The government supports the committee's recommendation to include contribution agreements that would involve the costs associated with the recruitment and retention of volunteers. So their response to that was that for transfer payments for programs that include the charitable sector and nonprofit sector, the Treasury Board of Canada will promote the incorporation of unique eligible activities and eligible expenditures. And this will include costs and activities associated with the recruitment and retention of volunteers needed to deliver a funded project or activity. So I just wanted to read that because I think that there is a little bit of hope that there might be potential, when you apply for funding, for the leaders of volunteers to say, look, if we're applying for this program, don't forget to include a portion for us.
And can you just tell people where to find that or the name of it so people can pursue?
Yeah, absolutely. I received it through Volunteer Canada, but you know what?
Or if somebody wants to put it in the chat.
Sure.
Yeah, if
that would be great.
Paula, that would be.
Yeah, so that's a great example of how the advocacy efforts that you're doing on a broader perspective and about volunteerism help move us forward and help get the message out that volunteers don't just get defrosted out of the freezer, that it's not enough just to look for volunteers to solve our problems, that we have to have the capacity to engage people well. And it sounds like the work that you're doing is certainly aligned and supporting the work of our members. So speaking of that, let's ask the MC to bring forward Amanda, to bring forward a few of the questions from our members who have been listening, who is wearing many hats. I love that analogy of volunteer managers wearing many hats.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Reva. So I have been monitoring the chat, and it's been wonderful to see that there's actually more comments and conversation happening, which is fantastic for the networking that we come to conference for. We do have some questions though. One had to do with the links that are in the chat. They are going to be collected and shared with everybody. So I'll start with that one. There is a question for Bernadette. So we'll start there. How do we build on the sector recognition in this budget?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, home and government would be great. I think that increased communication between those who are already active would be great, increased coordination, and to ensure that effort is placed where it's warranted and needed. We have an e-newsletter that we distribute to the sector, and our kind of theory around building engagement and increasing it is the sort of pyramid network building approach, where the bottom part of the pyramid is about communicating and connecting folks, closing triangles, disseminating information, mobilizing knowledge. The second part of the pyramid is really about building alignment where affinity might exist between different sector actors. So doing different convenings, more targeted information, more targeted increased engagement on particular issues. And then the top being results and action on particular policy files. So that's something that we're working to do a lot at Imagine in our advocacy program. And the first step is really signing up for our e-newsletter to find out more about areas of alignment and opportunities to advance policy files.
That's great. So I'll go to a question for Paula, and then there are some other questions. If we don't have time for them though, we will collect them and we will go forward with getting answers to those questions. So for Paula, do you have any script resources for managers to have the right words when approaching senior management boards?
We have some things that are contained in some of the blogs that we have been doing, and I can send some links to specific ones because there have been some that we have. For example, when we've talked about the contributions of volunteers to the Sustainable Development Goals, we have some blogs that speak to the importance of the infrastructure around natural disasters and so on. So I'll get some links to some of those blogs, as well as some of the other information that may be useful. I think that in terms of volunteer centers, we do have an outcomes measurement guide that was created a number of years ago that speaks to the importance of community-wide mobilization of volunteers, particularly in disasters. So I'll definitely send a series of links for sure.
Fantastic. And this is for any of our panelists to consider answering. Many of you have identified advocacy as a long-standing issue. How do we make sure it doesn't stay a long-standing issue? What are some systemic changes that need to happen for volunteer involvement organizations to promote volunteerism and volunteer engagement? I mean, and that's a big question for sure. But if anybody wants to possibly take a crack at it with at least one of the things. And just to that question, there are actually comments that have been going through the chat where people are discussing this issue, especially with, there's different things being brought up, like racialized people also need to be at the table, and that could be part of a solution as well. Advocacy for volunteers to have resources like immunizations, for instance. So there's lots of conversation happening. But for that question, like how do we make sure this doesn't continue to be a long-standing issue?
I think that, you know, I think it's always going to be in it. Like advocacy is just going to be part of it. I mean, nonprofit as a whole, you know, fundraising, advocacy, supporting our community, we're constantly evolving. So I don't think it's ever going to go away. But I do think that, you know, in my time, and I've been in the profession over 20 years now, I feel like we constantly have these conversations over and over and over and over again, but there's not a lot of action. And I mean, there is moving parts, and every few years we see some great strides, and we're constantly waiting for something. And I don't know what exactly it is that we're waiting for, something to just change. And I think acknowledging that we hold that power, I've said that before, is a huge component of that. But I think we also need to look at the why. I'm really big on whys and looking at how did we get to this point? And we've had some amazing people in the profession who have done amazing work. We've had great organizations that have done amazing things, but then we're now, and I know, Burnett, you mentioned like the national occupational standards and stuff. Well, you know, I'm glad to see that that's kind of starting to be looked at, because you know, things change so rapidly in our field, and keeping relevant is really important. And so if we look at the why are we having these conversations right now, why? And it's not just the pandemics that's caused this. We would eventually have had these conversations regardless of the pandemic. What does that look like? And I think we need to really assess that and work together. I think collaboration is incredibly important. We are not isolated. Volunteer Canada is not alone. VMPC is not alone. You know, Imagine Canada, not alone. We're all working for the same common goal. So why aren't we having more conversations? Why aren't we bringing people to the table for those organizations, and then including people that aren't within those organizations that are in the field working on the ground level to sit at that table as well? We talk about being at the leadership table in an organization. Why aren't we doing that?
Yeah, and that's fantastic, because I think that really is the first step to the last question here, which is how do we make sure that the sector is at the table with government? And it really does start with conversations among ourselves and strategic plan, and then advocacy. And yeah, well, so to our members who are attending, thank you so much. If you did add more questions, the questions will be collected and we'll try to get some answers to you as well about that. And Helena.
Hi, that was very interesting, and I'm sorry we really had to cut off those questions, but wonderful sharing. Well done. Want to thank Riva for facilitating and our panelists for sharing. It was fantastic. We're going to go into a short It's now an 8-minute break. I apologize because right back at 12:30, we're going to be breaking into some groups to do some more discussing of what we've heard this morning, which is fantastic. So please take your, as we learned last year at Live, your bio break or quickly check your emails, have a stretch break, come on back in, 7 minutes. 12:30, we start right back up. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much, Paula. We'll connect after this.
You bet. Bye-bye. Take care, all.
Bye.